So I have been thinking about something that Justin Mooney discussed years ago, a deontological theodicy of sorts. Taking a deontological account and applying it to God. It is not that moral obligations restrain or restrict God, it's that God can enter into those relationships, moral obligation relations, and thinking about how moral dilemmas could illuminate why God did not save everybody. And then this also relates to Calvinism and Arminianism, and Molinism as well could be thrown in the mix on how to understand divine providence. God's relationship to evil is really what this is all about. And so I need to read Justin Mooney's paper. He has a couple papers related to the topic. He's done a lot of work on God's relationship to evil, or the problem of evil. I was just thinking about some fundamental questions of God's purpose with human beings. So consider this. Suppose God intends to create a world in which he brings about the incarnation of his eternal divine Son in Jesus Christ. And he intends that his Son lives a perfect life and dies upon the cross and is resurrected for the salvation of people. Okay? So Jesus lives and dies to be the substitutionary atonement for the sins of people. Okay? So suppose that's God's intention, is to bring about those two goods. And let's stipulate that those goods are the greatest goods. Or maybe we should say some of the greatest goods that God can bring about. And God, when he creates humans as moral agents, God creating them as moral agents and endowing them with dignity or intrinsic value, and I understand there's a debate on how do we understand intrinsic value, because if it's treated much like a dependence relation, then there cannot be any intrinsic value. It would have to be some sort of instrumental, or it would be type of value that is bestowed. And so it would seem like it's extrinsic, but it's possible for something to have properties that inhere in it. So I don't see any reason why there can't be properties that make something valuable in itself, right? And grant that, this value is given to it, but it has it in itself, right? In virtue of someone giving it to it, in virtue of it being received, right? And so I still think the concept of intrinsic value is illuminating, and I think that that's the proper term to use here. Okay? But it's not necessary for this to get off the ground. We could just appeal to a divine command theory here and just say that moral obligations come from God. God has, and we could see this illustrated in covenants in the Old and New Testament, right? So God has legislated moral obligations between himself and his moral free creatures, namely human beings made in his image. And we could say that God has moral obligations and humans have moral obligations. Humans' moral obligations is to obey God. And we could stipulate further to know God, to love God, to serve God. Okay? And then God's moral obligation is to promote the well-being of his free creatures, right? And so that constitutes love in some respects, right? A willful act to will the good of the other, right? So we could see this as love, and we may even want to say the preservation. That's a little tricky because God would have the right to end life. God is not, because we understand that God creating is an act of grace. God is not required to create, right? And the medievals would understand that being is greater than non-being, right? And being is a good in itself. And this is why this is related to the subject of hell and God preserving the existence of people and not allowing annihilation. That is a good, that's a mercy. It's God's grace, right? So being, just existence itself is a gracious act on God's part. God is not obligated to keep anybody in existence, all right? So I don't know if we could say preservation, but let's just assume God's moral obligation is to promote and preserve the well-being of his free creatures, right? Let's go with it. And by extension, God's moral obligation would be to save all morally free creatures, right? In some way, shape, or form, right? And so this does not entail universalism, but it does entail a universal intent upon God's part. God intends this. God wants this, okay? And this is consistent with Arminianism and Calvinism. There are some Calvinists that deny that God wills humans obey and come to be saved, right? There is some streams of that, but I mean, this is where there needs to be additional distinction. So God intends to save everybody, but he does not bring that about. And this is where the deontological account can really illuminate this. Suppose that God has a greater moral obligation since God is the highest good, God's greatest moral obligation is to express God as the highest good. And God is dispositionally and occurrently loving, right? And we can think of the intertrinitarian relations between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So God is intrinsically, dispositionally, and occurrently loving at all times. Unless you're a Unitarian, and then you might only believe that God is dispositionally loving, which I find that problematic. But let's this is not here to be a critique of Unitarianism, but I think that's a legitimate challenge. So let's say that, so God is loving both dispositionally and occurrently. So in what way is God revealing or expressing that he is the highest good? This is where the Calvinist and the Molinist could appeal to Romans chapter 9 and argue that God is revealing, God is both dispositionally and occurrently through creation and through his providence, bringing about the salvation of some and the damnation of others, right? And God is doing this indirectly. It is not direct in terms of salvation, we would say God is directly bringing that about, right? He is bringing it about directly by his irresistible grace, and both the Molinist and the Calvinist can affirm that. Congruism for the Molinist, they could affirm that too. And then for the Calvinist, irresistible grace, right? So God brings about the salvation of some, and he does so infallibly, right? And he does it, God gets what he wants in that respect. And then for the damnation of others, right? So in the salvation, God is expressing mercy or grace, right? He's bestowing his salvific grace. And then in the damnation of others, what he's doing is he is withholding his salvific grace, right? God is not obligated to save everyone here, because his higher obligation is to demonstrate both his justice and his mercy, to reveal that God is the highest good. And here it seems like, okay, are you contradicting yourself? Well, no, what I'm doing is I'm saying that God can have both a lesser and greater moral obligation, and God cannot simultaneously bring about both moral obligations. He cannot fulfill both moral obligations at the same time, because the moral obligations conflict. If God saves everybody, then he is not going to demonstrate both dispositionally and occurrently his justice in punishing sin. Right? He is not. He's not going to be able to do that. If God does demonstrate dispositionally and occurrently his justice in punishing sin, then he cannot save everybody. Right? And again, God is morally obligated to save everybody. That is the lesser moral obligation. But the higher moral obligation is to display dispositionally and occurrently God's justice and God's mercy, or God's grace. Or you could even go with God's love, right? But it would be the kind of love that would be discriminatory or discriminatory. It would be the kind that would be specific, not universal, right? So this is just a thought. There could be, so suppose you don't buy God's purpose is to bring about the display of his justice and mercy, right? His wrath and mercy, okay? Wrath and grace. Okay, so let's assume that is not something you're going to buy. Okay. Well, then let's consider some alternatives, okay? So suppose God's intent is to instead bring about, like I stated, those goods of the incarnation and the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ, okay? Those goods, we have to admit those goods, specifically the latter, the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ, his death for sins, that requires sin to exist, okay? God intends only to bring about what is good, and those particular goods, okay? But those goods entail the existence of evil, okay? And so God, he could foreordain, everything that exists, the past, present, and future in one decree, Okay? And God would only intend what is good, but the evil will come about with the good, right? Because the evil is contingent upon the good. Or maybe I should say it this way, that what is good requires specific evils to exist, right? Jesus' substitutionary atonement for sins, it requires that sin exists. And so when God brings about these two goods, by necessity, it also brings about the existence of evil. And God does not intend evil to exist. So we can think of this as an unintended consequence. And sometimes there's a double effect, right? So take all of those facts and then two other alternatives that maybe God intends to bring about, that could be the reason. Maybe we could say this, that there are two other moral obligations that could prevent God from saving everybody, right? Like two other moral obligations that we might consider that would be higher than saving everybody. One is soul building, right? God is intending to bring about the character of his creatures, right? And that would require that they have to meet the moment, they have to overcome adversity. That still would not explain precisely why God does not save everybody, right? And so then the alternative to that would be libertarian freedom. And libertarian freedom, it is consistent with, I believe it can be consistent with Calvinism and Molinism, right? And to give you a couple examples, so Oliver Crisp wrote a paper defending a Calvinist libertarianism. Okay, I don't know if it was much successful. I know that James N. Anderson and Paul Manatta critiqued it significantly. Then there's also Sean Luke has written a paper where he articulates a synthesis of Calvinism, Thomism, and Molinism, and it's quite interesting paper. I think he is, unless someone shows me otherwise, I think he's proposed an interesting account to overcome the grounding problem. So maybe freedom is the reason why God has chosen not to save everybody, right? But then we could still say that God irresistibly saves some and withholds his saving grace from others, right? And that entails salvation for some and damnation for others, independent of any human merit or any human actions, independent of faith, right? So this would be unconditional election, right? So these are some interesting considerations. I still think the initial proposal that God can have a greater and lesser moral obligation, and the greater moral obligation God would be obligated to fulfill the greater obligation, and it would be impossible, whether logically or metaphysically or ethically, it would be impossible for God to fulfill both moral obligations at the same time, because they conflict, right? So it takes the idea that a moral obligation, God would be obligated to fulfill the greater moral obligation, and by him not fulfilling the lesser obligation, God is not, I want to say that God is morally praiseworthy and God is morally God is morally praiseworthy, fulfilling the higher or greater moral obligation and not fulfilling the lesser obligation. Okay? And I'm just thinking about this. This would be an interesting proposal. I think that this needs to be worked on more, to think about. Yeah, it's just something to think about. I'm still pondering it. What exactly that would... Is this viable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Peace and God bless.